The Selfish Giant, retold from the original by Oscar Wilde. Once upon a time, in a far-off country, there lived a giant. His home was as big as he was, because giants live in huge castles. This giant's castle was enormous, and it was surrounded by a splendid garden with all kinds of plants and inhabited by all sorts of pretty little creatures. There were birds in the trees, butterflies on the flowers, and children on the lawns. The children had great fun in the castle garden, which they entered through an opening in the surrounding wall. The giant himself could not stand them, but fortunately he was not there. 7 years before he had gone to visit his monster friend, the Cornish ogre, and had still not returned. So, after school, the little children slipped into the castle garden to play, running round and having fun. Then, one afternoon, the giant returned home unexpectedly and surprised the children who were busy enjoying his beautiful garden. Naturally, he lost his temper completely. "A crowd of noisy whippersnappers have invaded my property," he snapped. "This cannot be allowed." He began to shout with his giant voice, "Get out! Get off my property! Go back to your own homes, you children, you midgets!" The children were so frightened of his big booming voice that they took to their heels, left the lawn, slipped through the space in the wall, and disappeared. The giant was happy to be back in complete possession of his beautiful garden. He didn't want to share it with anyone, and he was so possessive about it that straight away he began to protect it against invasion from outsiders. He decided to strengthen the surrounding wall, to close up every opening, and to plant a row of stinging nettles. The work was quickly done. When he'd finished the job, the giant hung up a sign which read simply and clearly, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." The children continued to hang about the castle, longing for the garden where they used to play. Then, although it was spring elsewhere in the country, winter came to the giant's garden. The children came out to play again, but they didn't go back to the castle garden that had been closed to them. Spring didn't return to the castle garden either. It seemed to have forgotten to make the trees in the park blossom, and no birds sang on the branches. Frost, snow, and wind reigned in the selfish giant's castle and in his garden. Snow was happy that spring had forgotten to melt it. Frost, with its voice that made folk shudder, cried, "I rule the ground with my icy fingers," and wind whistled all day. When Hale heard about the party that was going on in the giant's garden, he wanted to join in too. So he put on his best grey cloak and joined in the cold dance with Frost, Snow, and Wind, and the giant spent the day looking out of the window at the weather. A layer of cloud hung over the castle and stopped the sun from warming up the rooms. However many clothes the giant put on, he just couldn't get warm, so he shivered all day long. The giant spent more and more time in bed, listless and downhearted, listening to the moaning of the wind, the downpour of the rain, and the rattling of the hail. Then, one day, he heard singing coming from the garden. Hi guys, I hope you're enjoying the audio ebook. I won't keep you for long. Last year I was demonetized by YouTube, and so I lost all opportunity to earn. But I love sharing the audio ebooks with you so much, I carried on. If you value what I'm doing here, please consider heading over to my other channel, Book Club, and hitting that subscribe button as a sign of support. The link's in the description. Now, back to the book. Enjoy. The giant made an effort to sit up in bed and managed to look out of the window. He could hardly believe his eyes. All the bad weather had gone, and the birds were singing on the branches of the trees. "Spring has returned to my garden," the giant shouted, and when he looked down into the garden, he saw that Hale had opened up the hole in the surrounding wall again, and the children had come back into the garden, bringing spring with them. Laughing happily, they ran about on the lawn and climbed the trees, and as if by magic the grass became green and full of flowers again, and the plants were covered in new leaves, while little birds flew about happily everywhere. The giant was fascinated by what he saw, and it made him stop and think. He realized that it had been his own selfishness that had let gloom and misery reign for so long, where, thanks to the children's games, the joys of spring and the singing of the birds now triumphed. But there was one corner of the garden which was still held prisoner by the ice, a single tree covered in snow, suffering from winter's bite. At its foot there was a little child in a white tunic who was too small to reach any of the branches of the tree. The little one's playmates were too busy having fun to notice anything, but the giant saw him struggling and decided to put on his slippers and go out immediately to help him climb up the tree with its branches still covered in snow. When the children saw the giant rushing towards them, they were terrified and ran away as they had always done. "Don't run away, my little ones," he cried out. "The garden belongs to you now." But when they heard this, they didn't believe him and just kept on running. Over by the tree, the weeping child in the white tunic hadn't noticed the commotion, so, still wearing his nightshirt and slippers, the giant strode over to him. The giant picked up the little boy with his enormous hand and gently put him down on a branch of the tree. And he could see that the little boy was trembling with fear, so he whispered, "Don't be frightened, my little friend." Suddenly the tree was full of delicate blossom, and birds started singing in its branches. The giant was touched. The contact with the child, a tiny figure in a little white tunic, made him feel just like a rough old tree caressed by the youthfulness of spring. Suddenly he made a decision. The children who had run away were standing near the opening in the wall. They had been watching the giant with pounding hearts, but when they saw the giant coming towards them, looking friendly, they were no longer afraid. When he saw how surprised they were, the giant assured them that he was quite serious. He would never drive them out of the garden again. And to prove he wouldn't change his mind, he ran back to the castle to get a pickaxe and, in the twinkling of an eye, he knocked down the surrounding wall. Then he offered sweets to all the children and stayed to play with them. The huge giant had never felt so happy. He was free of the terrible loneliness he had been feeling. He regretted the many selfish years and felt happy they were over, but was delighted to see his garden crowded with children and spent whole days just watching them playing. People passing near to the castle were amazed. The selfish giant had become generous. Soon word got around and more children arrived who wanted to play in the giant's garden, as well as many curious people who just came to see this good giant. The giant sat watching the children playing happily together, but there was only one thing upsetting the good giant. The little child in the white tunic had never been seen in the garden again. So he went up to the children and said, "Where is my little friend in the white tunic? You must remember him. I helped him up into the tree in the garden." However, none of them could give him an answer. They hadn't seen the child in the tunic for a long time, and he hadn't been back to play with them. Every day after school was over, the children came to play in the castle garden. The giant was always there to meet them and share a joke with them, but he continued to ask after the little child in the white tunic. "Tell him to come back. I'm waiting for him." That little boy had been his favorite, and he was missing him. The giant waited hopefully for him, but he waited in vain. Time passed. The hours, days, seasons, and years went by. The children grew up and the giant grew old. Now he was almost always sitting in his chair, watching the games in the garden. Every day, every hour, he felt a little more tired. But he never gave up hope of seeing the little one in the little white tunic who still occupied his thoughts. One winter's morning, the giant looked out of his window as usual. Naturally, the garden was all frozen, but incredibly, one of the trees was bursting with flowers, just as if it was spring. Taking a closer look, he could see, sitting on a branch of the tree, the little child in the white tunic. Full of joy, the giant rushed out as fast as his tired old bones would let him, made his way across the snow-covered lawn, and finally reached the tree, covered in flowers. Sitting on the branch, the child smiled at the giant and said, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come to my garden, which is paradise." Looking at the child, the giant finally understood the friend he had missed so much was none other than an angel from heaven. And when the children came to play in the garden that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, covered in the most beautiful blossom. The end. If you value what I'm doing here, please consider heading over to my other channel, Book Club, and hitting that subscribe button as a sign of support. The link's in the description.